Hi, thanks for visiting Bible Mountain. This is the 9th lesson in the series of lessons in the book of Jude. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about verse 6. In the first lesson in this series, I talked about why Jude was written and why it's in the Bible. Essentially, Jude recognized that people had secretly crept into the church who were turning the grace of God into sensuality and denying Jesus. He wrote to address those issues. For the purposes of this series of lessons, I've divided Jude into 5 sections. The first section is the introduction. The second section reminds us that Jesus is a judge. The third section states the problem. The fourth section states how Christians should respond to the problem. And the fifth section is the conclusion. In this lesson, I'm going to look at verse 6, which is part of the second section, reminding us that Jesus is a judge. Before we get into that, let's talk about why Jude reminded us that Jesus is a judge. If you remember in verse 4, we saw why Jude wrote the book of Jude. He recognized that people had crept into the church who were turning the grace of God into sensuality. And Jude wrote to refute that. And the way he did that is in verses 5, 6, and 7. He talked about Jesus being a judge. He reminded us that Jesus not only is gracious, he is also a judge. And he did that with 3 illustrations. He talked about the Exodus, he talked about angels, and he talked about Sodom and Gomorrah. In this lesson, we're looking at verse 6, where he talked about angels. So with that as some background, let's get started in verse 3. We'll read verse 3 and 4, which tells us why Jude wrote this book. Then we'll read verse 5, which is the first example of Jesus being a judge. And then we'll get into verse 6, which is the subject of this lesson, where Jude uses the example of angels to remind us that Jesus is a judge. So let's start at verse 3. Beloveds, making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write to you, urging you to contend for the faith which has been delivered over once for all to the saints. For certain people crept in secretly, those who were long ago designated into this judgment, ungodly people, turning the grace of our God into sensuality and denying our only Master and Lord Jesus Christ. Now I want to remind you, you who know all things once for all, that Jesus, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe. And angels, the ones not keeping their own realm, but having left their own dwelling, he kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. So if we break down this verse, we see that Jude was talking about angels. He was talking about the angels who did not keep their own realm and who left their own dwelling. And then he stated that those angels were kept in the eternal bonds for the judgment of the great day. Let's take a closer look at this. Let's talk about the word angels. That's a translation of the Greek word angelos. Let's look at some usages of that word to see what that word means. This is Luke 7, verse 24. When the messengers of John had left, he began to speak to the crowds about John. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? And so we see the word angelos is translated messenger. So an angel is a messenger. In this case, it's referring to the messengers of John the Baptist. Now let's look at Mark 13, verse 32. But of that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Now this usage is more like what we typically think of when we think of angels. Angels in heaven. But we have to understand that the meaning of the word really is the idea of messengers, so you could also think of angels as being messengers from heaven. And then Luke 22, verse 43, now an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. Again, this reinforces the idea that there's many messengers from heaven, and we usually think of them as angels. And I believe that's what Jude is referring to here. He's talking about angels or messengers from the spiritual realm. And Jude was specifically talking about angels or messengers who did not keep their own realm and who left their own dwelling. So let's take a closer look at this. Let's look at the word realm. That comes from the Greek word archen. And let's look at some examples of that word being used in the New Testament. This is Revelation 22, verse 13. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. So this Greek word has the concept of the beginning. We also see that word in Titus 3:1. Remind them to be subject to rulers, to authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good deed. here that Greek word has the concept of rulers. So when it talks about angels who did not keep their own realm, it's referring to angels who did not keep to the place that they had from the beginning, or the place where they were supposed to rule. We also see that these angels left their own dwelling. The word dwelling comes from the Greek word ekaterion. Let's look at that word. This is 2 Corinthians 5, verse 2. For indeed in this house we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven. And so we see that Jude is referring to these angels or these messengers who left their own realm. They left the area that they had been assigned to from the very beginning, and they left the place where they were supposed to be dwelling. So what we see here is Jude was referring to angels who left their proper place, they left their proper function. And because of that, they were kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. So let's look a little closer at this. They were kept. That means that Jesus, or God, was keeping these angels somewhere. He was keeping them under bonds. The word bonds is the idea of being in prison. Notice that these are eternal bonds, and so this is an eternal imprisonment. They will never be released from this. This imprisonment is described as being dark. And then we see that the reason they're being kept is that they're being kept for a judgment. And it specifically talks about the judgment of the great day. So let's take a look at that concept of the judgment of the great day. This is Matthew 10, verse 15. Truly I say to you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. So what we see here is that in the New Testament time period, there was this concept of this future day, which would be a day of judgment. We're not told when that will be. I don't know that we have a lot of details about it, other than we know that some point in the future, there's going to be this big thing called the day of judgment. We see this in Matthew 12, verse 41. The men of Nineveh will stand up with this generation at the judgment, and will condemn it because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here. And then 2 Peter 2:9. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation, and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment. So again, there's this concept in the New Testament about this future day, which will be a day of judgment. And that's what Jude is referring to here. These angels who did not keep their proper abode, who did not keep to their proper function that they had had from the beginning, they were being kept in bonds for the judgment of the great day. Now this concept of angels having left their proper function and being kept for judgment is a concept we see in other verses in the New Testament. This is 2 Peter 2, verse 4. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment. Then we see Revelation 12:9. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So again, we see this concept of these angels who had followed Satan, and they were punished for following Satan. So let's talk again about why Jude referred to these angels. Jude pointed out that there were some angels who had left their proper function and they were being kept for the day of judgment. Why did Jude mention that? Well, again, the reason Jude wrote the book of Jude is there was people in the church who were turning the grace of God into sensuality. They were abusing grace. They had this idea that since God is gracious, then there are not consequences for sin, therefore sin is not serious. Jude wrote to refute that, and one of the arguments Jude used to refute that is the reality that there are angels who left their proper abode, and they are being kept by God in bonds for the judgment of the great day. And so that's a reminder to us that Jesus is not only gracious, he is also a judge, and we should live our lives accordingly. Thanks again for visiting Bible Mountain. If you have already joined my email list, thank you, and please forward this to someone else who would benefit from visiting Bible Mountain. If you have not joined my email list yet, please do so now. My email list is free. In order to sign up, go to BibleMountain.com, click on email, and that will take you to a page where you can sign up. Your email address will not be sold nor given away. Once again, thank you for visiting Bible Mountain.